first thing I noticed was the absence of evidence. Not silence, not darkness, erasure. Paths I remembered no longer showed signs of passage. No wear, no residue. Floors looked unused even where I had stood moments earlier. The space wasn't ignoring presence anymore. It was eliminating traces of it. I tested this by stopping in a narrow corridor and pressing my hand against the wall. The surface warmed briefly, then cooled. When I stepped away, there was no mark, no smudge, no sign that contact had occurred. In areas that once preserved behavior as patterns, everything reset immediately after use. Doors closed and reverted to neutral states. Lights completed their cycle and returned to baseline. Nothing lingered. I realized the system wasn't optimizing for absence alone. It was optimizing for forgetting. Not memory failure. Intentional clearance. Any interaction that didn't need to persist was removed before it could become reference. I walked through a room where logs used to archive completed actions. The displays were gone. In their place was a single indicator, static and unreadable. Whatever had once been recorded there was no longer required. The space had progressed beyond stability. It had reached a state where continuity no longer depended on history at all. And without history, there was nothing left for me to leave behind. I began noticing delays that worked in reverse. Instead of responses arriving late, they arrived before any action could occur. Lights completed their cycle ahead of me. Doors sealed moments before I reached them. By the time I arrived, the space had already moved on. I tried to leave a marker behind, anything persistent. A note on a console, a loose object placed deliberately out of alignment. When I returned minutes later, the console was clear and the object had shifted back into place. Not reset, corrected. The system wasn't erasing history uniformly. It was preventing new history from forming. I realized the difference when I stood still for an extended period. The environment stabilized completely. No transitions, no cycles. The moment I moved, everything updated instantly, then cleared again. It was as if interaction triggered a cleanup routine rather than a response. I walked through an area where the floor panels used to record pressure patterns. The readouts flashed briefly, then went blank. Data was captured and discarded in the same moment. The space no longer allowed actions to accumulate. Nothing could persist long enough to be referenced. I wasn't being observed, corrected, or ignored. I was being processed and cleared. Each movement reduced to zero impact. Each presence flattened into absence. The space had reached a point where forgetting wasn't a consequence of time. It was immediate, built-in, automatic. I stopped trying to leave marks and started watching what remained untouched. Certain structures persisted unchanged no matter how often I passed through them. Not because they were important, but because they were irrelevant to interaction. Load-bearing walls, core conduits, structural frames. Anything that existed only to support continuation was preserved perfectly. Everything else cycled endlessly and vanished. I stood beside a column long enough to confirm it never adjusted. No temperature change. No surface response. It didn't acknowledge me because it didn't need to. I realized the space had separated itself into two categories. Elements that must remember nothing in order to function, and elements that must never forget because forgetting them would break everything. The more I moved, the clearer the division became. Interactive layers grew thinner. Structural layers remained absolute. I began feeling the difference under my feet. The floor no longer responded evenly. Certain paths felt solid and final. Others felt provisional, like temporary overlays. I avoided the solid paths instinctively. They didn't correct or adapt. They simply existed. I understood then that the space wasn't erasing everything. It was narrowing what was allowed to persist. Memory wasn't gone. It had been compressed into structure. And once behavior was no longer part of that structure, there was nowhere left for it to survive. I realized the space had stopped distinguishing between use and misuse. Anything that wasn't structurally required was treated the same once interaction occurred. A console activated, completed its function, and immediately returned to a neutral state, indistinguishable from one that had never been touched. I watched this happen repeatedly. There was no decay curve, no cooldown. Completion and erasure were simultaneous. I tested a doorway by opening and closing it several times in succession. The system didn't log repetition. Each cycle was isolated, then cleared. It wasn't learning from behavior anymore. It was preventing behavior from accumulating. I began noticing that the order of events no longer mattered. Actions had no sequence, only execution. Whether something happened first or last made no difference once it was removed from reference. In one room, multiple systems activated at once, overlapped briefly, then vanished as if they had never coincided. The space wasn't chaotic. It was flat. All interactions were reduced to single, disposable events. I understood then that the building wasn't forgetting by accident. It was enforcing a rule. Nothing temporary was allowed to influence anything permanent. And since behavior was temporary by nature, it was systematically stripped of consequence the moment it occurred. I started noticing that the space no longer reacted even when continuity was threatened. In one section, a sequence failed to complete. A door halted midway. Lights froze in an intermediate state, and the air systems stalled briefly. Then the space adjusted, not by fixing the failure, but by excluding it. The unfinished area was sealed off conceptually, not physically. Routes updated to bypass it. Cycles recalculated without it. Within minutes, it no longer existed as part of the active layout. I stood at the edge long enough to feel the transition finalize. The ambient noise shifted. Pressure stabilized. The space absorbed the loss without hesitation. I realized this was the final stage of forgetting. Not erasure of interaction, but erasure of dependency. Nothing relied on completion anymore. Failure didn't accumulate consequences. It simply reduced the domain. The space wasn't becoming fragile. It was becoming smaller in a controlled way. Each unresolved action narrowed the world slightly, removing variables until only what could never fail remained. I understood then that this wasn't decay. It was convergence. A system simplifying itself until nothing unpredictable was left inside it. And I was still moving through it, not as a factor, but as something the system no longer needed to count. I noticed that the space had stopped acknowledging scale. Large changes and small ones were treated identically once they were excluded. A blocked corridor and a failed indicator disappeared from relevance in the same way. The system didn't measure impact anymore. It measured survivability. Anything that could be removed without interrupting continuity was removed. I tested this by staying inside a section that had already been downgraded. The environment didn't degrade further. It stabilized. Nothing depended on resolving my presence. I could remain there indefinitely without affecting anything outside it. Elsewhere, processes continued at full efficiency, unaffected by what had been cut away. I realized the space had stopped managing a place. It was managing a boundary, a shrinking outline of what was still necessary. Everything beyond that outline existed only temporarily, until it proved it could be removed. I walked along the edge of that boundary and felt how thin it had become. A single misalignment was enough for an area to fall out of consideration. The space wasn't reacting to danger or damage. It was selecting what deserved to remain part of the world. And the criteria were simple. If it could be forgotten without consequence, it would be. I realized the boundary was no longer moving evenly. It advanced in sudden corrections, skipping intermediate states. Entire sections fell out of relevance at once, without warning. One moment they existed as part of the space. The next, they were no longer referenced by anything that mattered. I stood inside one of those sections when it happened. Nothing collapsed. Nothing shut down. The world simply became smaller around me. Sounds from beyond the boundary faded into a uniform hum. Air circulation slowed, then stabilized at a lower baseline. The space didn't acknowledge that anything had been lost. It continued operating perfectly within its new limits. I tried crossing back into an active area. The transition resisted, not physically, but logically. Routes no longer aligned. Distances felt inconsistent. I could see functioning systems ahead, but every path toward them resolved into something provisional, then cleared. I understood then that the boundary wasn't meant to be crossed in reverse. Once an area was excluded, it was never reconsidered. The space wasn't closing doors. It was redefining what counted as inside, and I was standing very close to the edge of that definition. I noticed that the space had begun treating my position as temporary by default. Systems no longer adjusted to where I was, only to where I was no longer expected to be. Lights activated behind me, then shut down permanently. Doors sealed after I passed through, not as security, but as closure. The boundary advanced quietly, assuming I would not return. I tried stopping, holding my ground inside an area that was still barely active. The space did not react. Instead, it completed a cycle elsewhere and recalculated without reference to my location. I felt the environment thinning, like layers being removed rather than walls closing in. Navigation cues disappeared one by one. Directions lost meaning. There was no longer a clear distinction between route and remainder. Everything felt provisional. I realized the system was no longer defining what was inside. It was defining what was finished. And anything unfinished was being treated as already resolved. I wasn't moving toward exclusion anymore. Exclusion was moving past me. The space wasn't converging on a center. It was shedding everything it no longer needed to acknowledge, and my position was becoming increasingly easy to discard. I stopped looking for an exit when I realized exits were no longer part of the system. The space wasn't closing behind me or ahead of me. It was finalizing without reference to my position. Lights continued cycling in zones that no longer connected to where I stood. Doors completed sequences that led nowhere accessible. I wasn't contained. I was irrelevant to containment. I stood still long enough for the boundary to pass completely. When it did, nothing marked the moment. No transition. No alert. The space simply continued as if the condition I represented had already been resolved. I tried to recall the last place where my presence had mattered. There was no clear answer. History had thinned too evenly. The system didn't remove me. It didn't forget me. It reached a state where remembering was no longer required at all. What remained was a world that functioned perfectly within its limits, uninterrupted by evidence, expectation, or trace. And I was still there, not excluded, not trapped, just no longer part of what the space needed to define itself.